sexual harassment legislation. My name is Sarah Gray and I'll be your host. I'm joined by one of my colleagues, Lily Evans, who will take note of any questions that we may have that come up during the course of the presentation. What we'll do is we'll compile a Q&A sheet of those questions and answers together with a link of the recording, and we'll send that out to everybody who is participating today. So you will have that to refer to. So the big question is, why are we here? The New Worker Protection Act 2023 takes effect on Saturday, the 26th of October, 2024. This replaces the current Equality Act 2010, and there are a few changes that employers would be required to take all reasonable steps, and it also proposed a reintroduction of a duty to protect workers against harassment by third parties. And by third parties, we mean clients, contractors, agency staff, suppliers, etc. Instead of all reasonable steps, the new Act places a new duty on employers to take just reasonable steps to prevent sexual harassment. So the word all is missing. All, however, implies a higher level of diligence and effort that employers exhaust every possible and reasonable step that could apply in a circumstance. But in reality, I think it is better to try and satisfy all the known risks as soon as possible anyway. The requirement to protect workers from third parties, whilst not covered in the new Act, is something that the Labor government included in their Employment Rights Bill, which you'll be aware came out not that long ago, 10th of October. So my advice is that it is prudent that we start thinking about this too and include it in the provision for any changes that you make. Clause 16 of the Employment Rights Bill indicates that they will include the word all, so it will again go back to all reasonable steps. So again, something to think about when we adjust our behaviours and look at our compliance for the 26th of October. We know that the other two things are reasonably imminent, and so it stands to reason, rather than taking two bites at this, that we get our ducks in a row and go forth as we intend to finish. There is always debate when governments use the term reasonable, and the interpretation of this usually falls out from cases that are put before the Employment Tribunal, but we'll talk about that in a little bit more detail soon. I've just lost my ability to change the slide deck. It's disappeared from me. Hold on 1 second, everybody. I'm so sorry. Oh, we've moved to the second slide. Great. Sorry, just a little technical issue. My objective today is to cover the following: our legal obligations as an employer and what will take place under the Act, what sexual harassment is, some compliance strategies to protect workers and employees, and clearly your business as well, tips on what you can do to meet that compliance, and we'll also go through a case study. If we can move on to the next slide. Great. We're looking at what is different. So there are a few key differences from what we have now. Sexual harassment is already prohibited, as we know, in the workplace. However, the new Act seeks to place a more proactive approach on the duty of employers to prevent it from occurring. Tribunals will have a new power, enabling them to uplift the compensation claim for sexual harassment by up to 25%. Now, I'm not Robinson Crusoe, I don't think, when it comes to disliking the term reasonable steps when it comes to legislation. I'm sure there are probably a number of you who feel the same way. The term reasonable in legislation is there to provide flexibility and practicality when looking at the duties of an employer. There are some key principles, however, that help us identify what this actually means and gives you some explanation. And I'll go through those now for you. The first one is proportional to risk or harm. Now, when we look at this, let's consider potentially a hotel with a public bar as an example. There's a good chance when you mix adults with alcohol that inhibitions get loosened, and the chance of someone being inappropriate is potentially higher than in a standard office environment where you might be processing data. At least we'd like to think so, but perhaps more on that later. For the purposes of this, it is important for you to assess the risk relevant to your individual workplace and then introduce measures that are proportional to that risk. Feasibility and practicality. So thinking about our previous example of a hotel bar, what is feasible and practical to do in line with operational needs, considering factors like cost, available technology, size of the business, all those sorts of things. In this example, if you were a busy hotel in the city, the questions you might need to ask yourself, or the factors you might like to consider, are: do you employ security? Do you have cameras? Do you have more than one person rostered at any given time? I'm going to use an example that brings home to me how important it is to consider your bespoke environments. I spent quite a considerable time of my employment working for a peak industry association dealing with real estate. And regrettably, there was a spate of very serious crimes against property managers. Now, property managers in real estate agencies ostensibly are young females, they were at the time. They are people who go into tenants' homes with notice, but not always particularly welcome. The tenants that they deal with might come from very different socio-economic demographics. And it came to pass that a number of property managers over a fairly short space of time were attacked whilst in the conduct of their role. It turned the industry upside down, and there were some measures that were put in place, industry-led measures that were put in place. And certainly individual companies decided to go over and above some of those industry requirements. So some of the things that they did in that situation was to look at what the risks were. They made sure that their property managers always worked to a schedule, that they didn't go out to visit tenants in their homes without making it clear to the office exactly where they were going to be at any given time. Where they knew that they had problems with tenants in terms of their aggressive nature, or if they had rise for concern, they would send out 2 property managers to do that at the same time. Now, that's not feasible to do in every circumstance. It would have cost far too much money and been completely impractical. But they assessed the risk based on what the known risks were and what they could do to circumvent that. So they had property managers going out in 2s where it was necessary. Some agencies also gave their property managers some of those, what do you call them, the panic alert buttons that old people have to call for help, because quite often in a circumstance you may not be able to grab your phone and text back to the office if you're in a situation that's urgent and dangerous. So they gave them panic buttons to wear so they could instantly call for help if they needed it. There were apps introduced where they could actually log in when they started to go into a property and then log out when they exited, so that the office was able to make sure that, as far as humanly practicable, that they were safe and okay. So that's an example of feasibility and practicality, to identify what the potential risks are and then to really consider what you can do to implement something to consider safeguarding your employees and your workers. Another situation might be where you have somebody who sells blinds and curtains, for instance. A client will call up to say, I'd like to consider having some new blinds. Can you send somebody around to measure up and show me some samples? So again, you've got somebody going into the home of somebody else, and what is the risk of that? Now, probably not as high a level of risk as where you have a property management situation where the property manager isn't necessarily welcome. In this case, it's a different type of relationship. But still, what can you do to mitigate a potential risk? We spoke a little bit about industry standards previously, but think to yourself, is there an industry norm in the industry that you currently work in? What are other people in your industry sector doing to protect their workers? What are the known risks? You only have to think about going to the doctor. I'm sure most of you will have seen the signs up, making sure that you are aware that there is a zero tolerance against abuse of staff. You see the same thing in hospitals. So this has become a norm for that kind of sector. Consider if you were a doctor's surgery and you didn't have a sign up like that, and you did have an incident of abuse against one of your employees, how would you justify that you've taken all reasonable steps, given that you've gone pretty much against the norm of what other surgeries are doing? Sorry, I jumped the gun there and changed my slide. I didn't mean to do that. Bear with me. The next point in the slide is good faith and effort. So the question is, are your efforts to evaluate the risks and introduce measures, are they done in good faith and with a genuine attempt to protect your workers rather than just a tick box exercise? Now, reasonable efforts don't mean that you're required to take excessive or burdensome measures that go far beyond what is necessary. Legal precedents, it's easier to understand exactly what it's expected once we've had a few cases come through the tribunal and precedents have been set, which will help put context and interpretation into the mix. But at this stage, we will have to use our common sense until such time as we see how the tribunal is evaluating what reasonable steps are and how they're adjudicating against that. Balance of rights. How do you balance the rights and needs of your employees with other stakeholders in the case of sexual harassment? I can't think of any right that overrides the rights of your employees in this circumstance. I'll give you an example that I was privy to a number of years ago, where there was a business that had a reasonably small warehouse. They had a team of 10 people, 10 warehouse operatives working there. 8 of them were male and two females. And they would have their break at lunchtime. The men had got into the habit of talking about life, and that included talking about the women in their lives and some of the exploits they got up to out of hours. Out of the 2 females, one of them was quite happy to engage in the same conversation and laughed and joked in the same way as the 8 men in the team. No problem at all. However, the other one was offended. She didn't feel comfortable, and it took quite a while for her to gather up the confidence to actually make a complaint. When she did that, one of the men on the team put in a counter complaint to say that his rights were being overlooked, that he had a right to enjoy his lunchtime with his mates, and there were 9 of them enjoying it. Why should one person out of the whole team change the way that they spoke and change their enjoyment and the way that they interacted with each other? Well, now clearly he didn't have a case. But I think what it does is it makes us realise the different perspectives that people have on these issues and how important it is to communicate this and train people and educate them on what is right, what is fair, and what is reasonable. You also need to consider equity. Sexual harassment is sometimes erroneously attributed as a problem for women to endure, but we know this is definitely not necessarily the case. This type of behaviour is not gender, age, race, or faith specific. Sexual harassment can occur between same sexes as well as between different sexes, and men are often exposed to sexual harassment in many situations. So just something to bear in mind. The last one on this list is documentation and monitoring. And this is very, very important and a crucial element of how you demonstrate that you have taken the appropriate steps, the reasonable steps to protect your workers and employees. We'll go into this in a bit more detail in a few slides' time. But remember, not having documented evidence on how you've assessed the risk, what risks you've identified, what measures you've put in place to circumvent the identified risks, and then a process for what happens if a worker is sexually harassed or assaulted, means that it will be highly, highly unlikely that you will be able to defend a claim that you did take reasonable steps to prevent it from happening. Now I can change my slide. What we're going to look at here is what actually constitutes sexual harassment. Harassment is any act that has the purpose or the effect of violating a person's dignity or creating a hostile, intimidating, degrading, or offensive environment for them. It does not have to be intentional. Now, there are a number of things on this list. Let's have a little look through them. One of them is sexual comments or jokes, including banter. Now, I can't tell you the number of times over the last number of years that has been a key defence for anybody who's been accused of sexual harassment. It's just banter. We were just joking. We were just having a laugh. It's not my fault that they don't have a sense of humour. That's very often the defence. It is not acceptable. So sexual comments or jokes is a key one. Displaying sexually graphic pictures and posters or photographs. I don't think that happens in workplaces very much anymore. I'd like to think not. But I remember back in the day where you go into a motor mechanics workshop and you'd be, exposed to a whole array of semi-clad females up on the wall as posters. That was quite the norm. Not anymore. Written words, suggestive looks or staring or leering. Things that are overt, like propositions and sexual advances, asking for sexual favours in return for something, sexual gestures, that can maybe not be as overt, but still that is something that constitutes sexual harassment. And this is another one that I think happens more regularly than not. Intrusive questions about a person's private or sex life, or a person discussing their own life. So it may not be done with the intention of causing sexual harassment or causing harm or causing upset. But quite often you hear questions to people, who they might come into the office and say, I've just met a new girlfriend, or I've just met a new boyfriend. And then the next question might be, well, did you get any? Or something inappropriate like that. It's not beyond the realms of possibility. So it's those kinds of things which are not necessarily meant to cause angst, but actually may cause angst. It's asking somebody if they're young, if they're still a virgin. It's asking somebody if they're old, if they're still getting some, or once they're married. It's not appropriate. It's not right. But people will often do that, as I say, without anticipating that they're actually doing something wrong. So again, it comes back to careful communication, it comes back to training, it comes back to awareness. Sexual posts or contact on social media, spreading sexual rumours about a person can be very hurtful and very damaging. Sending sexually explicit emails or text messages. Now, quite often this might be an amusing meme or a joke that gets put out on a group chat in a work environment. 90% of the people might find it funny, but there'll be some people who might not. It's activity that really needs to be looked at and curtailed. Things like unwelcome touching, and hugging, massaging, kissing. Think some of those that would be very overt and you would understand that's definitely a no-no, it's definitely taboo. But things like touching and hugging, you know, there are people who are huggers amongst us. It's a matter of saying, are you a hugger, or would you like a hug, or do you mind if I give you a hug, rather than just launching yourself into it. But these are things that need to be discussed, and as I say, the best way of doing that is through training and through talking through actual examples of what happens and how these actions can be perceived. So quite often, sexual harassment is behaviour that is actually condoned in the workplace and ends up only when it becomes a point of complaint that it gets looked at. So things can go on for ages, nothing gets said about it. In other words, it becomes a bit of a cultural norm. So take an example of a group of people, a team that work together for a long time. They communicate with each other, they banter, they rib each other, they socialise potentially with each other outside of work. They get to know each other reasonably well. They know each other's boundaries. No one is offended, they enjoy each other's company, they work well together, everything is fine. Nobody says anything, even though they hear things, think, oh, that might be a bit off, or that's a bit close to the mark, but you know, nobody's complaining, everything's okay. Enter a new employee who does not have the same sense of history, may have very different views and perspectives. They don't understand what's gone on before. They don't know what other people's boundaries are, and you certainly don't know what their boundaries are, and that's where the problem starts. So remember, sexual harassment does not have to be sexually motivated. It only needs to be sexual in nature. It's also not necessary for the employee or worker who feels affronted by those behaviours to say that they object to the behaviour for it to be considered unwanted. Although tribunals will often consider whether it's reasonable for the accused person to have known or expected that that behaviour would be unacceptable. And as the slide indicates, it can be conduct that was previously welcomed, but then becomes unwanted. So you may have a circumstance where somebody joins in what is commonly referred to as the banter, the team discussion, the conversations, and quite willingly and quite happy to do that. But something might change in their lives. They might have a personal relationship with somebody who has been a victim of sexual harassment or sexual crime, and that can completely change their perception and their view about what is acceptable and what is derogatory and what they will not accept and what makes them feel uncomfortable. So just because somebody has previously accepted certain behaviours, it doesn't mean to say that that is something that you can expect will continue, and that can be a change. Now, I want to put up 2 quick polls. They're anonymous, and please only respond if you feel comfortable to do so. The first one is, have you ever personally been subjected to sexual harassment in the workplace? Given what we've just gone through as what constitutes sexual harassment, I'll be interested to see if there is personal experience from this group about that. And the next one is whether you've witnessed sexual harassment in your workplace? So a simple yes or no. If you feel comfortable, please do that now. Lily, I'm presuming that's come up. Perfect. Thank you. I'll give you a moment to do that. Thank you for everybody who's participated in that. What I want to move on to now is a focus of our attention on compliance. So the starting point, really, from my perspective, is an audit, or call it a risk assessment. The emphasis being on preventative duty by anticipating when and how sexual harassment may occur. The preventative duty only applies, remember, to sexual harassment, not other forms of harassment. A technical guide has been put out by the Equality and Human Rights Commission, and it states an employer is unlikely to be able to comply with the preventative duty unless they carry out a risk assessment. The link to this guide is on the slide, so you will get it as part of your pack after the webinar, and I would strongly suggest a read through of that. It's a very good document. The slide identifies some of the ways in which you can demonstrate effective measures to ensure that you comply. A good culture, and quite simply, this starts from the top. Senior leaders in your business and organisation need to play a pivotal role in creating a respectful and inclusive culture free of any harassment. They must be seen as role models, and that's something I would strongly urge you to get your senior leadership team on board with. Policies need to be relevant. They need to be easy to understand and very accessible. So it shouldn't be hard to find. It should be something that is right there in their face, that they're able to pick up, read, understand, and be able to comply with as individuals. Regular communication on the topic. So don't just leave it for training days or big events. This is something that should form part of regular discussions in one-to-ones. Ask the questions, keep it live as a topic of conversation. Make sure that you have processes to deal with issues as they come up. So it's all very well having a policy and stating what you will do, but then you need to have processes that you actually follow through with and you act upon. I've mentioned training a few times during this session already, but I can't emphasize the importance of that. And it's not a one-off training, as I said. It's training and communication about that training. Also consider what support you have and can provide to employees who are victims of harassment. And regular updates of all of the above. It's not a once done and then to be forgotten exercise. It's something that you need to continually revisit. And remember, it's not just about compliance for compliance sake. There are very, very good reasons to prevent sexual harassment in your workplace. Harassment can and does have a profound and long-lasting negative impact on a person's well-being and can be very, very damaging, not just on their mental and physical health, but also in their work productivity. So it's something that we need to get on board with. Here are some ideas on how you can comply. Preventative action requires employers to foresee and prevent potential sexual harassment scenarios. So the big takeaway from this is don't wait till it's too late. Don't wait until you have a complaint. I would also suggest that you designate someone or a group of people in your business to lead and drive this initiative so that it does not fall by the wayside and it does have some impetus. It can also be worth considering listening groups to gauge opinion from your employees about what they witness and experience and what suggestions they might have. And when we think about audits or risk assessments, I think it's important to audit the business and the scope of operations to identify the potential risks, but also to audit employees about their experiences and identify, what they have encountered and what their views are. It might be surprising, and it serves as a good benchmark then for future audits so that you can gauge how effective your policies and procedures and your efforts have been. There should be an opportunity to provide information anonymously, of course. Whilst I advocate for listening groups, not everybody, and particularly those that may have been a victim of sexual harassment, will want to talk openly in those forums. So I think you need to be measured about how you collate information and have a variety of methods to use to be able to do that. Now, there's no point in going through an audit or a risk assessment without acting on your findings and putting preventative measures in place. So it's all very well identifying where the issues might be, but what are you going to actually do about it, and how can you demonstrate that you have taken those actions? An audit is important because it can identify the prevalence and nature of sexual harassment in your business, and you might be surprised. It can help you identify if your policies, training and communication are effective, and it can also help you ascertain if your complaint handling process is effective. If you are struggling with how to do an audit, please speak to us. We will be introducing an audit service for this to help with anyone who might need to avail themselves of it. So get in touch. This is a little bit of a visual action plan. So identify the situations where sexual harassment may occur, implement measures to prevent these occurrences where reasonable, take appropriate action after sexual harassment occurs, and revisit your risk assessment and update it on a regular basis to ensure that you put further measures in place as required. EHRC is, of course, for those of you who have been around for a while, the Equality and Human Rights Commission. This is a slide which identifies what their powers are now, or will be. So a worker can lodge a claim of sexual harassment against their employer with the Employment Tribunal. And if they're successful, the Employment Tribunal will then obviously order the employer to pay whatever compensation is relevant to the worker. Say that's a compensation of £40,000. That can be compensation for loss of earnings and injury to feelings. So that's what the Employment Tribunal will do. The tribunal must then consider whether the employer has breached their preventative duty, and if so, whether to apply a compensation uplift. So even though the employer has anti-harassment policies and procedures in place, if they have not delivered any training or communication to management or staff on these policies, this will have an impact on that decision. In addition, if when the worker has raised a complaint of sexual harassment with their employer, it was either not taken seriously, or if the employer didn't follow their own procedures that are outlined in their policies and procedures, then this again will be another factor that's taken into consideration when looking about whether they provide an uplift to that compensation. So under these circumstances, it is likely that the Employment Tribunal will order the employer to pay a 25% compensation uplift. And this would ostensibly raise that £40,000 compensation to £50,000. So that's a large sum of money, and one that most businesses can ill afford. This is an expensive exercise if you get it wrong. And compensation for sexual harassment, as I put on that slide, can include compensation for past and future loss of earnings, as well as I said, injury to feelings and personal injury as well. Is there any good news? Is the big question. So if there is good news, this is it. If you've done what you reasonably can, and you then have a chance to defend a claim, it's as simple as that. Of course, the flip side is if you haven't, then you are most likely to be in trouble. So prevention is better than cure in this case, without doubt. Looking at now, please, at the case study that I pulled together. I think it's interesting, and I think it will highlight a few of the things that we have spoken about. So this was a case study based on a sexual harassment audit that was conducted on a council, a local council that has 2,500 employees. 72% of the respondents of that audit said that they had been subject to intrusive questions about their personal life, or that had comments made about their appearance, and that was the most common complaint that they had. The next was sexually suggestive comments or jokes, very high still at 65%. And don't answer out aloud, but just think for a moment about your own workplaces and consider what type of result you might get by asking these questions. It's an interesting one. And then, of course, we look at the impact of sexual harassment. Now, clearly, this has an impact on mental health, esteem, and confidence. So you can see there that the figures that came out of that particular audit. It's interesting to note that there were additional comments made on this audit about the fact that sexual harassment worsened working relationships, and that's not just with the perpetrator, but sometimes more broadly. And I'm suggesting that that might be that once somebody has raised a complaint or has raised an issue, that there may be a turn against them by a group of people who think they're wowsers, or they just don't have a sense of humour, and it can really impact on how they are able to continue working in that environment. So it's really important to think about that. And of course, this type of behaviour also caused a lack of respect and, interestingly, lowered employee trust in the organisation that they worked for. Now, what do we get from this? Sexual harassment, I guess, is bad news. So when we look at those statistics, it's not a great picture. It's bad for employees. It's bad for our business, and it's something that clearly can result in high levels of compensation that needs to be paid. So financially, it's not viable as well, and it needs to stop. No one should be going to work and being subjected to behaviours that have these negative impacts on their well-being. Now, I'm wondering if we have any results from our poll, Lily. Okay, I've got some answers here. That's great. So actually, people who responded to whether they have ever witnessed sexual harassment in the workplace, 50%, that's not good. And have they ever been personally subjected to sexual harassment? That goes up to 57%. And that's the group that we're talking to today. That's not great. So if it's happened to you, it's happening to others. And this is something that you really need to think about, the circumstances, and you can use your own experiences to help look at what those risks are and what you can do to mitigate those risks. When we look here, this is about the prevalence of sexual harassment in this audit. And this really shocked me. Only 2% of the respondents said that they'd made a formal complaint. So the vast majority of people who experience sexual harassment in the workplace suffer in silence. They don't make a formal complaint. And we have to ask ourselves why. And I think that culturally, this has become a bit of a norm. People are frightened to speak up. They're frightened to be seen as somebody who's rocking the boat. They don't want to be seen as somebody who doesn't get along with other people, who can't see a joke in things, or who's being overly sensitive for all those reasons. So what we need to do is in our workplaces, have a safe place for people to be able to speak out. We need to encourage it. We almost need to say to people that they have an onus of responsibility to talk about and shout out situations that they think are inappropriate. We need to make talking about it and stopping it more of a norm than just wearing it. So what we can take away from this case study is that sexual harassment is potentially more prevalent than we may first consider. The other alarming takeaway from this is that 90% of the sexual harassment that had been identified in this audit occurred during normal working hours. So it is happening as part of your normal everyday at work. And let's not dismiss that nearly a quarter of respondents said that they had been harassed by a third party. So again, when we're talking about the provision that may come in once the employment bill has been looked at, there is a possibility that this will be extended to third parties, but we already know from this that it is something that happens. So I would suggest that when you do your risk assessment and your audit to comply with current legislation, that you don't disregard what's happening with your third party group either, because it's clearly something that is a reality. We also identified as part of this audit who those people were who are at higher risk. So the audit basically shone a spotlight on the most vulnerable employees when it came to sexual harassment. People from the LGBTQIA plus community were of the highest percent there. But then young women between the ages of 18 and 34, 42% of women in that age group were deemed to have been sexually harassed, and that's a very high proportion. And sadly, people with a disability as well. So this does not paint a very healthy picture for this particular organisation, and I hope that your organisations have a better picture. But you'll only know that if you go into the detail and ask the questions. So whilst this is a big audit, these results are in fact reflected in other data that we have on sexual harassment statistics. So again, consider these when thinking of your own workplaces. And if you're setting up listening groups, I would strongly suggest that you make sure that there is representation. If you have these groups within your workplace, that you include them in those processes. It could be very valuable. It would also be important to consider the higher level of risk for these groups in your risk assessment and the actions that you can put in place to mitigate those risks against those employees and workers. How are we going for time? I thought we would take 45 minutes. I'm 2 minutes over. I feel really quite accomplished. So we've got a couple of minutes for any questions. So I'll be happy to take those now. Liddy, are you able to see the questions in the chat? Can you speak them out, and then I'll.
Someone actually asked how regular is ongoing when it comes to the communication and training for keeping the team up to date.
Okay, so the question, if you didn't hear, was how regular do you have to make those ongoing sessions for communication? I think that will largely depend on your organisation, the size, and how often you have staff turnover, because that's the other thing. You know, if you only do it annually, you're missing a treat in terms of how often new staff are inducted into this, unless you make it part, as you should, of your induction process. I would suggest that your first audit or risk assessment will indicate how big an issue it is in your workplace, and that might drive how regularly or when the next assessment needs to be done. I wouldn't leave it. If you identify that there's a high risk in some areas, and that there has been identification of people who have been subject to sexual harassment or have witnessed it in your workplace, that you do your regular your next session reasonably soon, that you don't wait for 6 months, 12 months. I would suggest that you do that within the next 3 months, because what you want to do is to keep up on top of this. I hope that helps. Any other questions?
Tina asked, is there a deadline to ensure all employees are trained after the changes in legislation?
Well, the legislation takes effect from the 26th of October. So any complaint that happens after that, you'll be subject to making sure that you've complied. Now, if the complaint, I'm guessing, happened prior or was introduced prior to that date, then I'm suggesting that the old rules might apply. But get onto it straight away. I don't want to risk the idea that the Employment Tribunal won't look at the legislation as it stands as of the 26th of October. And if you have a tribunal hearing after that date, I would strongly suggest that they will hold you to account with the legislation in its current form as of the 26th. So if you haven't been able to undertake all the training by that date, which is not that necessarily feasible, but you have a schedule of training, or that you've identified that you will put training in place, what that training will cover, you will be able to demonstrate then that you are satisfying your ability to, or that your not your ability, but your duty to take reasonable steps. So I would suggest that you, if you can't do the training quickly, you at least put together your plan and make that as concrete as you possibly can.
Can the training be part of an online platform, or is there any advice on doing face-to-face training?
There is no reason why it can't be on online platform. What I wouldn't do, though, is use that as the sole mechanism. It's very hard, even with online, assessment, to make sure that the message has really hit home in the way that you intended. So I would, if you're going to do online training, that's absolutely fine. I would supplement that as well with discussion. I wouldn't just leave it to one method of communication. Different people learn and take on information in very different ways, and I think you need to cater for that. Again, it comes down to the kind of people that you are dealing with in your workplace. If you're dealing with white-collar professionals who are used to self-learning and self-professional development, giving them an online course might be safer. If you're dealing with people who don't do a lot of reading for information, or who are largely people from a non-English speaking background, who may not read the information on screen or understand it without further explanation, then you run a risk. So think about the demographic of people that you are training and what is most appropriate for those people. And as I say, I would take a disciplined approach to that, and try and make sure that you use a variety of tactics to be able to get that messaging out. Anything else, Lily?
In terms of preventative duty, will a sexual harassment policy be considered?
Okay, preventative duty for a sexual harassment policy. Yes, you need to have a sexual harassment policy. If you are a a client of our HR advice or HR administration, you will be given that sexual harassment policy that you can customise to your own purpose, but it will be fit for purpose for the new legislation. But you will definitely need to have something in place to satisfy that requirement.
We have still got quite a few. Do you want me to take?
Well, we've got a couple of minutes more. So
Yeah.
if there is anything else,
Absolutely.
Lily, if you're happy to yell those out.
Is there anything else that the organisation can do as a part of the preventative duty?
Okay, if there's anything else that an organisation can do, well, we covered off on a fair number of things, so it might be worth your while going through that list, but certainly starting with the premise of undertaking a risk assessment or risk audit will highlight what actions you need to take. So every business will be different. There will be different learnings that come out of your assessment, and depending on the type of industry sector that you are involved in, and as we talked about, you know, that list of what is reasonable, go back to that list. Think about the criteria for each of those points, like, you know, the proportional risk assessment, the feasibility. So that's what I would draw your attention to really interrogate afterwards. And of course, we are here to help you. So if you get stuck on something and you want further advice, please reach out to us. Probably time for one more.
Would you suggest a standalone policy, or can it be merged with bullying and harassment?
I have a view that it doesn't matter whether it's merged with other forms of harassment. The one that we have currently is an anti-harassment policy, and it segments sexual harassment as one of those. So as long as you have it, and it's readily identifiable, it's easily accessed, and it's clear, and you stick to it, then it doesn't matter if it's embedded in a broader anti-harassment policy. It doesn't have to be standalone. There's nothing to indicate that that's the case. All right. Well, look, I really appreciate the questions. They are very helpful, and we will, even the ones that we haven't answered, I will answer them. I'll put a sheet together, as I said, of all the questions that we've received today, and compile that. It will go out to you all with a link to this presentation, and you'll be able to refer to it later. So all that remains before we go is to thank you very much from myself and the whole of the Cintra HR Outsourcing Services team. We are passionate about our role in helping employees navigate their way through the legislative maze, and as I said, we're here to help you with advice if you need it. So from now, see you next time, and thank you very much. Goodbye.